Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com, and today I'm actually drawing a female archer that was requested by one of you guys. So there's a couple of design elements that went into the creation of this piece. So obviously before I started working on anything, I reference female archers to see what type of poses they would typically do. Women tend to walk and move slightly differently than men, so it is important to give that female aspect to the character. Once I figured out roughly what I was going to do pose-wise, I started sketching out digitally the pose that I was contemplating on doing. So this is what I'm currently working on, as you can see. Now, when I started off figuring out the pose, all I did was a basic stick figure. Essentially, that allows me to get in the basic information that I need and then work the structure around that without getting too caught up in the details for this character. So, once I figured out a pose that I really liked, I started figuring out the proper anatomy, which direction she was going to look, what type of emotional state I was going to try to showcase with this character. So once I figured that out, as you can see, I started adding some more detail into the character, working out, finalizing some of that structure, but also adding some additional details for the costume design. Most of the reference that I saw online for female archers, they were wearing modern day clothes. However, I did want to make this character more of a medieval type, mercenary type archer. So initially I did have a plan for a very large bow for this character, but given the fact that she was most likely a mercenary, I did have to later on shorten the bow significantly to make sure it was obviously a lot more portable. So I went through a couple different concepts for the clothing design, but I decided to have some of the material as almost a sash beside her without taking away from the curves that naturally occur in a woman's body. That's probably the most important part of drawing a female character, is even with all the armor that you have on the character still needs to have a very appealing pose, and it needs to showcase her curves and her posture extremely well. Because that is such an important factor when it comes to female character. So as you can see, I'm just roughing out some of the background. Plotting down my basic shadows before I actually start adding my highlights and some hints at my shadow. Now, what I've found is for female characters, I do approach the shading a little bit differently. Generally, you want to hint more at the shadows rather than fully fleshing out all the detail. It's kind of like the character itself, because they don't have a lot of hard edges. It's more of curved edges on their contours. You do need to take a very minimalistic point of view when you're actually shading a character like this. So I slowly add in my shading, and I try to keep it as minimalistic as possible. If I add too much detail, then it just takes away from the character, and that's the last thing I want to do in this case, because I do want to showcase this character, but the focus is on the overall body shape, the overall posture. It's not on the details. So for this character, obviously, I started off just hinting, and then I slowly added in some additional information as I was working, so that I ensured that I wasn't adding too much at the same time. As you may have noticed, I do start off with that contour edge that I've talked about in the past, and the reason why I do that is, first of all, I can turn off my line layer below it if I need to, and I could still keep the general information that I need. but it also makes sure that the character is popping out from the background enough that she doesn't blend into it. So unless I'm actually painting a character that is supposed to actually blend into the background, who's camouflaged, I want that character to pop as much as possible. She needs to be almost a separate element, because in this case the focus is the character, it's not the background. The background is considered secondary. It's very important, but it's still considered secondary to the character design. So for this reason, I do make sure that the character does have a backlight, and that's essentially what causes that a very strong edge behind the character. So once I've figured out her general body, I tend to leave the hands and the feet for last, just because they require quite a bit more attention than the rest of the body normally does. There's a lot of subtle details you need to make sure that are showing correctly, otherwise it just doesn't look right. Sharpening some of those edges in the boots to make sure all the information still reads, but without too much line as well. I'm doing the same in the clothing as well. So now I've just started on the feet, and as you notice, I added that white border essentially around the general structure so that I could turn off my line layer if I needed to. That gives you so much flexibility, because your character shouldn't need the line work once it's fully painted in order to be able to show all the information that you want it to. Now, I did notice at this stage that the leg wasn't exactly correct, so what I did is I lengthened the top of the leg and shortened the bottom of the leg to make sure that it looked correct. Now I want some of those edges to be really crisp, so I went in and I just added some additional highlights and shadows. Now for the hair, I do have a specialty brush for doing this now, but for the longest time I didn't have a specialty brush. You don't require a specialty brush to draw hair. Essentially, if you really want to get those strands to show properly, just take a normal round brush, set it to 100% opacity, and quite literally put it as small as you can before you can't see it. And that's essentially how I've painted hair for the past 2-3 years before I actually got this specialty brush. Essentially, you don't really need a specialty brush to paint hair. It does speed up the process, which is very useful, but you do learn a lot more if you do it by hand the long way initially and then start using that specialty brush. You'll learn a lot more in the long run. I recently had a question by one of you guys asking about how do I get those nice crisp edges. Literally, I'm still using the soft brush, but all I've done is I've reduced the size to such a small size that you can't notice the fuzzy edges around it. Another method you could use is it's essentially the same method. You'll set it to 100% opacity, but you use the hard brush if you want a really nice hard solid edge. That's all you have to do. You don't have to change any of the settings. You just have to change the size and the opacity. You want to set it to full 100% opacity. And if you do that, you'll get really nice edges, really nice sharp crisp edges for your piece. Now, as you can see, I'm working on the trees right now, and all I'm doing is I'm changing the opacity of my brush as I work. I'm actually using a texture brush, but I actually go back to using the hard brush afterwards, just to make sure that some of those lines are really strengthened and become actually very harsh, because I do want to have that very solid look to them. Now, I just used a basic color layer above all my grayscale shading to give my initial colors, and then I go in and I add my additional colors on top. They're on two separate layers so that I can modify them as much as I want without affecting the other one. And then once I have that, I'll add in my my really dark band for the shading. By doing this, it really makes the character pop out more, and it gives the character a really finished look. Now there's 2 layers that I'm using for that. I set my layer to color burn, and then I created another layer on top, and that's just set to normal. But what I've done is I've sampled the darkest portion that I could find in the character and used that as my color. So this image is almost done. I'm going to be adding very shortly a blue light on the other side where she doesn't have currently any, well, where she has less lighting. The reason why I do that is to make the character pop just a tiny bit more, so that those shadows don't become too harsh. Now I've actually switched to the hard brush at this moment in time, and that's what I'm actually using to paint this, but I'm softening out the edges with a round brush for my eraser tool. And this is the final piece, and so thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you and take care.